Craig is an evolutionary ecologist and ornithologist and a professor B. Berry Distinguished Chair in Ecology at the University of Wyoming. Before moving to Wyoming in 2004, Craig was on the faculty in the Department of Biology in at New Mexico State University. He received a BA from UC Berkeley, an MS from Northern Arizona University, and a Ph.D. from State University of New York at Albany, and conducted postdoctoral research at Princeton University and the University of British Columbia. He's a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science and received the E.O. Wilson Naturalist Award from the American Society of Naturalists and the William Brewster Memorial Award from the American Ornithological Society. So thanks so much, Craig, for giving this talk on crossbill natural history and the Cassia Crossbill. Welcome.
I'll turn it over to Craig as he gets his screen shared, but let me remind everybody, we'll leave the chat open. So if you think of a question as you go, put it in the chat and we'll make sure we get to it at the end. All yours, Craig.
Okay, you see the screen? Is it showing? Do you hear me?
We can hear you. It doesn't look like it's in presenter mode.
Okay. Dang. Okay, let me try again. I'm going to get out of this. Hopefully. Okay. Now you see it, right?
Now we do, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about crossbills. Especially in the last couple of years, it's been fairly isolated and haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about crossbills. My wife gets really tired after a while, and my dogs don't care to listen to me. But I've been very privileged to study crossbills for almost 40 years now. I started studying crossbills in 1982 for my dissertation. I was living in the Northeast US, and I spent a lot of time in the Eastern Canada studying white-winged crossbills in particular. That was the common crossbill that I could find in good numbers. Then around 1990, I moved back west. I was originally from California, and I've remained in the West ever since, or at least lived in the West ever since. And here I've been studying red crossbills until the mid 90s or mid to late 90s. I found the Cassia Crossbill in southern Idaho, and that's the bird that I've spent most of my time studying because it's resident. I can find it a lot, and it also has a very neat natural history that I'll tell you about in a little bit. Because crossbills otherwise are very difficult to study. And you're probably familiar with trying to find, or maybe some of you or most of you have seen, hopefully all of you have seen crossbills, but sometimes they're here today and they're gone tomorrow, and they're gone for a year or two or three. In 2019, there was a huge ponderosa pinecone crop in the Front Range of Colorado, and there are a lot of red crossbills. They bred commonly in the late summer, they bred in the late winter, the early spring. But then since the spring and early summer of 2020, crossbills have been relatively scarce in the Front Range area. And that's because there have been no cone crops of ponderosa pine in the last 2 years. And actually it looks like there's not going to be a particularly good cone crop next year either. So we're kind of in a crossbill drought in terms of large numbers of crossbills. And this is illustrated from data from the Manitou Experimental Forest west of Colorado Springs. And what we have plotted here is the number of seeds per hectare in the thousands over time, over the years. And you can see that in 1983, there was a large ponderosa pinecone crop. And then 1986, there was a large pinecone crop. In 1990, and 1994. But in the intervening years, there were few cones and few seeds produced, if at all. And consequently, the crossbills need to to leave those areas. They pack up their bags, so to speak, and they take off, and they often fly hundreds of miles searching for a good cone crop. And, and to illustrate this, I want to show some data from Europe. It's summarized by Ian Newton in a paper in 2006. And each of these circles represent a crossbill that was banded in Germany. The solid black circles represent those individuals where they were captured subsequently that same year of the original capture. And you can see they moved, some of them moved a fairly long ways. They moved from Germany to southern Spain or to southern Greece. But if they were captured in a later year, which is indicated by the open, empty circles, you can see that a fair number of them occurred up in Russia. So some of these birds will move thousands of kilometers from one year to the next. And Newton noted how some birds might not, or birds that are hatched in one location might first breed 3,000 kilometers away. And then the next time they breed might be another 3,000 kilometers farther away from that second site. And so they're highly nomadic. They're more nomadic than any other songbird species in the world. And I've encountered that with some of the birds that we've color banded. Since 1998, we've been color banding crossbills, adult crossbills, in the South Hills of Idaho, in southern Idaho. And we color band all the birds. We were mostly focused on the Cassia crossbill, but we also catch type 2 and these type 5 crossbills that I'll mention in a bit. Anyway, this was a type 2 crossbill we captured in 2009. We uniquely color band it, so you can see that it has a reddish silver band or aluminum band here. It's a Fish and Wildlife band that we anodized red. And then there's a light blue over a black-white split band on the left leg. And so we know who this bird was. And then it was photographed by someone at a feeder near Casper, Wyoming, or at the base of Casper Mountain in Wyoming, 400 miles away. And so these crossbills are moving each year in search for cone crops. And one way to anticipate where you'll find these crossbills is to look at the cone buds or that you can find on the tips of branches. And that's how I used to spend, I'd always be looking at those. I still look at them all the time whenever I'm hiking or camping somewhere. I'm not tracking crossbills like I used to. I used to be more of a nomad. But anyway, if you're in the summer, let's say up in Rocky Mountains, in the Ponderosa Pine Forest or just above Boulder, hiking in the Ponderosa Pine, I'd be looking with your binoculars at the tips of branches. And if you see 3 or 4 conelets, kind of reddish or purplish colored little conelet buds or conelets at the tip of the branches in the summer, then on most of the branch tips on most of the trees, then you can be pretty confident that the next summer, you're going to have a lot of crossbills showing up and probably breeding by August and remaining hopefully through the winter and into the spring. And later in the year, so let's say this spring, if you're up hiking around, you can often, you'll see these larger kind of miniature cones that have grown some from the conelet stage early in the previous summer. But that allows you to basically forecast or anticipate where you can find crossbills. But I don't, studying the Cassia crossbill is what it's freed me up from having to worry about searching for these cones, other than for my more edification or just for enjoyment. But anyway, what I want to do today is just talk about several topics, 4 or 5 topics. The first one is, why are crossbills nomadic? And I've already mentioned that. And that's just because cone crops fluctuate, and they often fluctuate over large areas. And so, I mean, they fluctuate throughout their range, but they're often synchronous in the cone crops from year to year, so that over hundreds of miles, you'll have a large cone crop, and then you'll have failures for multiple years. And so crossbills will have to move long distances to find large cone crops after there's a failure in an area where there was a good cone crop. Second, I want to talk about why they have cross mandibles. Just simply, how do they use their mandibles? Why are they crossed? For foraging for seeds and conifer cones. And then third, I want to talk about, or basically describe some of the crossbill diversity and talk about what it's related to. And it's simply related to the diversity of conifer cone structures and seed sizes. Fourth, I want to talk a little bit about Cassia Crossbill natural history, in part because it's, I think it's really interesting, but it's also very different from, in some ways, from other crossbills. And then last, I want to talk about the future of the Cassia Crossbill. Unfortunately, its future isn't bright. And like for a lot of bird species and a lot of organisms on Earth, the future doesn't look wonderful. And so why do crossbills have cross mandibles? Well, the reason they have cross mandibles is that decurvature of the upper and lower mandibles allows them to exert strong biting forces at the tip of their mandibles. So if their mandibles were straight, like a siskin, and they bit at the tip of their bill on a hard object, they would shear off the tip of the bill. They break off the tip. But by having the upper and the lower mandibles decurved, those forces, instead of shearing forces, are now compression forces. And that allows them to exert and withstand much greater forces. Just think of your teeth. If your teeth stuck straight out and you bit on a hard object, it would break off the tips of your teeth. But by having your teeth opposing, vertically opposing, those forces, instead of shearing forces, are now compression forces, and it allows you to, again, exert and withstand much greater forces. So this allows them to form gaps between hard, woody pine cone scales. And then once they form a gap between the scales, they laterally abduct the lower mandible to the side. So they spread the lower mandible to the side to which the lower mandible crosses. They increase the gap between the scales to expose the seeds at the base. They have asymmetric jaw muscles. So the muscles on the side to which the lower mandible crosses, so on the right side of this crossbill, its muscles on the right side there are enlarged and allows them to exert these strong abducting forces to spread the scales apart. And here's a video of a ponderosa pine crossbill, or a type 2 crossbill foraging on a ponderosa pine cone. And you can see it abducting its lower mandible, spreading the scales apart. And they have a long tongue, much like a woodpecker in terms of the hyoid apparatus wraps around the back of the skull. And when they spread the scales far enough apart and expose the seed, they then protrude with their tongue, as you can see here, trying to lift the seed from the base of the scales. And once they lift the seed from the base of the scales, they husk the seed. That is, they remove the seed coat and discard the seed coat, then swallow the kernel. And then they repeat this hundreds to thousands of times a day, depending on the sizes of the seeds. And so there's this fair amount of diversity of crossbills. This shows the smallest crossbill on the left in North America, at least of the red crossbill complex, is called a type 3 crossbill, and it's specialized for foraging on the seeds in Western hemlock cones, the thin-scaled Western hemlock cones. And then, excuse me, and the crossbill on the right is a type 2 crossbill, or what I call a ponderosa pine crossbill. It's the largest crossbill north of Mexico that is common and widespread. Cassia crossbill is a little bit bigger. But anyway, this diversity of crossbills is related to the diversity of conifer cones out there in which to feed. In the United States and in Canada, there are about 55 species of cone-bearing conifers. And there's about 10 species or 10 forms of crossbills that differ in bill size. And they're each, that I know of, each of the ones that I've studied, and I haven't studied all of them, appear to be adapted to foraging on this a single species of conifer. And so there's a lot of conifers that don't have crossbills associated with, aren't crossbill trees. Turns out the conifers that are really important in the diversification of crossbills are ones that hold seeds through winter and into spring, and often usually into early summer, because they need those seeds throughout the year. Because as you know, most birds besides porwills don't hibernate. And so if you take videos of these crossbills, these are old videos I took in about 1989 or so, or 1990. It shows these two crossbills in that photograph. On the left is the type 3, the small-billed crossbills, a Western hemlock specialist, and the bird on the right is the large-billed ponderosa pine specialist. And each time they're lifting their head, they're husking a seed. And you can see that the crossbills on the left, the small-billed ones, are much more efficient at foraging for seeds in these western hemlock cones than the large-billed bird. So the small-bills are much more efficient at getting the seeds out of the cones, and they're much faster at husking the seeds. And if I had videos of these crossbills foraging on ponderosa pine, the bird on the right would be very fast on the ponderosa pine and would husk the seeds relatively fast, whereas the small-billed birds on the left, they would not be able to get seeds from partially closed cones of ponderosa pine. And if they could get the seeds, they wouldn't be able to husk them. They're just too hard and too large for these little billed birds. And so these trade-offs for foraging on these different resources is what drives this diversity of crossbills. And you can quantify this and so forth, and I've done that extensively. What's also important is not only bill size for getting seeds out of cones, but also palate structure for husking seeds. And what we have here is a cross-section of the upper and the lower mandibles. So the upper mandible and the lower mandible of a carduline finch. So a siskin, a redpoll, crossbill, house finch, Cassin's finch, pine grosbeak, evening grosbeak. Those are all carduline finches. And what they do is they secure the seed in a lateral groove of the upper mandible. You can see the seed here. And they secure it with the tongue. They use their tongue to hold the seed in the groove. Then they use the lower mandible to crack the seed coat. And then once they crack the seed coat, they use the lower mandible and the tongue to remove the seed coat and discard it. And then they swallow the kernel. And so you can envision that the width of that groove, or I should say the width of that groove, there should be a functional relationship between that and the size of the seeds. And crossbills, because of the mandible crossing, they always hold the seed or secure the seed in the side opposite to which the lower mandible crosses. So her lower mandible crosses to her right. She secures this ponderosa pine seed on the left side. You can see her tongue, the little kind of fleshy colored object in the middle of the mouth. And she's using that tongue to hold the seed against the roof of her mouth. And she uses the lower mandible to crack the seed coat. And this shows a photograph of the palate of a roadkill crossbill, or a red crossbill. And you can see these lateral grooves. And this bird's lower mandible crosses to the top here on its right side. And so this is where it would secure the seed. And so the trick then is to measure the width of that groove on a live bird, because that's what I was studying with these live birds, and I wasn't about to sacrifice them just to make a measurement like that. Well, fortunately, I was at the University of British Columbia at the time, and there was a dental school a couple blocks away. So I went over to the dental school, and they gave me tongue depressors and the mold material that dentists use to make molds of your teeth. It's just an epoxy-like material. You mix it together, you form a ball, you flatten it and put it on the tongue depressor, and you open the bill, the mandibles of the crossbill, you slide it over the mold, and you secure the mandible. You hold it there firmly for a couple minutes until the mold material hardens. Then you gently open the bill and slide it away, and you have a nice mold of the palate. Then you can make cross sections of that palate or of the mold, and you can then measure the width of that groove. And then you can relate that width of the groove to seed husking time. And it turns out there's this nice functional relationships between the width of the groove and the ability to husk seeds of different sizes. What's kind of neat is the two crossbills that are quite common, or the most common crossbills in Colorado, are the type 2 that I mentioned for ponderosa pine, and the type 5, which occurs at higher elevations in the lodgepole pine forest, and it's adapted to foraging on lodgepole pine. They're very similar in bill size. So if you were to catch one of these birds, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart unless they called. If they call, then you go, oh, that's so-and-so. But if they don't call, there's so much overlap in size that you can't tell them apart, unless you look at the palate. You say, you look at the palate and you look at the width of the groove. And it turns out the type 5 that forages and specializes on the lodgepole pine seeds, their grooves are much more slender than those for the type 2 that forage on ponderosa pine. So overall, what we find is that the variation in bill structure is related to the size and hardness of the cones, as well as to the size of the seeds. And that once you can understand that variation in cone structure and seed size and so forth, you can begin to understand the diversity of crossbills that are out there. And there are two main groups of crossbills. There are the wing-barred crossbills, which are comprised of three species. There's a Hispaniolan crossbill found on Hispaniola, mostly in the Dominican Republic in the high elevations in the mountains there in the pines. Pinus occidentalis, it's the only species of pine, native pine in the Dominican Republic or Hispaniola. Its bill is about the same size as our ponderosa type 2 crossbill, because the cones there are large, just like the ponderosa pine cones. Then in the northern boreal forest, we have the white-winged crossbill, which is a small, slender bill, which appears to be adapted for foraging on the cones or the seeds in the cones of black spruce. And then in Eurasia, you have the two-barred crossbill, which specializes on larch cones, much like the larch cones we find up in the northwest of western larch or the alpine larch. They're fairly similar in structure if you're familiar with those larches, much larger than the American larch or tamarack in the far north. And then there are the red crossbills in the New World and the common crossbills in the Old World. They're basically very similar. They've diverged probably over 100,000 years ago from each other, the two Old and New World crossbills. But there's a much greater diversity. There's over 25 taxa. Some are recognized as species, like the parrot crossbill here in the top. And others are just more call types or subspecies of crossbills. And the numbers here represent different formerly recognized subspecies of crossbills. And some of them are subspecies, especially in Eurasia. And the smallest one is in the Himalayas. There's two different forms actually in the Himalayas. But most of this variation can be easily understood in terms of the structure of the cones and seeds in which they feed. With the exception of these two, the Vietnamese crossbill here on the left and the Philippines crossbill. And so the Philippines crossbill occurs in the island of Luzon, the northern island in the Cordillera Central. And then the Vietnamese crossbill is found in the Dalat Plateau. And what's interesting is the Vietnamese crossbill is the second largest crossbill in the world. And the Philippine crossbill is among the smallest crossbills in the world. And what's very puzzling is that both species feed almost exclusively on Pinus Cassia, on the same species of pine. And the cones are not that different on these two areas. It's not a simple story to understand. I can tell you why the Vietnamese crossbill is bigger than the Philippine crossbill, but I cannot tell you why they are so different. We've measured lots of cones from both areas and so forth, and it's just kind of a tough nut to crack, so to speak. But it's an interesting story that I'll probably never figure out. But in North America, we have these call types that, again, you're probably familiar with. If you have a Sibley field guide or a field guide, at least Sibley mentions these different call types and shows the rough sizes of them. And Jeff Groth was the one for his PhD who did a lot of the basic work of describing all these different forms and showing how if you record the flight calls or the contact calls of a crossbill, which spectrograms are shown here in the right column, so frequency versus time. So if a bird gives a call like this at the very top, and you capture that crossbill and measure it, it's going to be a small-billed, small-bodied crossbill. And the range of variation of birds that give that call are roughly what you'd find in an average songbird species. And so we have these different, what we call, or Jeff called, call types. And we have some of these in Colorado. And so the two most common call types in Colorado are, as I mentioned, these are the type 5, the lodgepole pine crossbill, and the type 2 ponderosa pine crossbill. And let me just play some recordings of them. That's a type 2 crossbill. That's the commonest crossbill in the West. It's probably the one you're most familiar with. It's a fairly clear call. I'll play it one more time. It's a nice, clear crossbill call. And then the lodgepole pine crossbill type 5 is one, it's not ever as common as the type 2, but you can find it every year up in the lodgepole pine forests. So up around near Niwot Ridge, it seems like every time I've been in that area, I hear these guys, but not very many. You can hike all day, hike 10 miles up in the lodgepole pine forest, and you might just hear them once or twice during the day. But they have more of a metallic call, and it sounds like this. More of a metallic-like call. So those are the two common ones in your area. But the bird that I want to talk about more is the Cassia Crossbill here in the upper right. And so this map here we have in brown is a distribution of where ponderosa pine crossbills or type 2s are reasonably common. And then in purple are the lodgepole pine crossbills, the type 5. And you can see in southern Idaho, both the lodgepole and the ponderosa pine crossbills occur in this area of black. And that area of black is where the Cassia crossbill almost basically exclusively occurs, with one notable exception that I'll mention in a moment, or in a little bit. But anyway, in the South Hills and the Albions, that's where you find the Cassia crossbill. But the lodgepole pine and the ponderosa pine crossbills also occur in the South Hills and Albions, and they also breed there as well. But it turns out the Cassia crossbill looks just like any old red crossbill. The males are orangish brick red colored. The females are yellowish green, greenish more. This is probably an older female. And then the juveniles are streaked, just like any old good crossbill. But how they differ is they differ in their songs and they differ in their calls from other crossbills in North America. And so that's the Cassia crossbill, that call. It's more of a call. And then remember, this is a type 2, a clearer call, and the type 5 is the metallic call. But what's really interesting about the Cassia crossbill and the calls is I've been banding these birds, I think I might have mentioned, since 1998. I've been color banding these birds. And so we've color banded well over 3,000 adult Cassia crossbills. And we catch them multiple years. Some birds we've caught up to 8, 9 years. One bird was caught for 9 years. But anyway, we record these birds each time we catch them. When we release them, their flight calls. And it turns out that individuals change their calls subtly over time. And they change them in such a way that they become more divergent from the type 2 crossbill, which is the common other crossbill in the South Hills. And so you can see here are two birds. One is 6399. Here's a spectrogram of it in 2013. Then we caught it in 2014. And you can see it's basically increased this element. It's also lowered the overall frequency of the call a little bit, but it's gained more of this ascending element, which is what's distinct of the Cassia crossbill, at least when you look at the spectrogram, and that's what makes it kind of that more of a call. And you can see 6415, it's done the same thing. It's basically added or almost this ascending element. And so these birds subtly change their calls over time, become more divergent from the type 2 year after year. And then when they have kids, their kids learn their calls, the parents' calls. And so they basically inherit the calls of their parents. And so we get this cultural evolution of the calls. And what Cody Porter did, a student, a senior author of a paper in which we show these results, he went out to the South Hills and played recordings of an average call from about 20 years ago. And then he played the average call from that year. And it turns out that the Cassia crossbills were much more likely to come in, or more likely to come into their calls, the contemporary calls, than their calls 20 years ago. But what's really neat is that the type 2 crossbills that were in the area, they were more likely to come into the old calls. And so there's greater discrimination between these calls. And the result is that the Cassia crossbills are more likely just to be in flocks by themselves than to have type 2 birds joining the flocks. And why that's important is that the Cassia crossbills, like all crossbills, flock year round, even when they're breeding. But in late winter, when they start choosing mates, they're in flocks. And so if the flocks are made up of only Cassia crossbills, their mates are only going to be Cassia crossbills, and they're going to be assortative. And so they're going to be highly reproductively isolated from other crossbills. And that's what we find. But this evolution that's going on, this cultural evolution of the calls, is even strengthening those reproductive barriers. Well, here we have a map of lodgepole pine in black on the left. and in red, the South Hills and the Albions in the lower part. But throughout the range of lodgepole pine, or throughout most of the range of lodgepole pine, red squirrels are quite common. And if you've ever gone hiking up in the lodgepole pine, and even in the ponderosa pine, but especially the lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce forest, you find a lot of red squirrels. And red squirrels are superior competitors to the crossbills for seeds in the cones. And the reason they're superior competitors is they harvest vast quantities of cones in the fall, thousands of cones they bury underground, where they're unavailable to crossbills. The result is the crossbills are relatively uncommon in lodgepole pine forests in the Rockies. And I can attest to that just from hiking in the Rocky Mountain National Park or elsewhere. The crossbills are uncommon, but squirrels exert strong selection on the cones. So the squirrels drive the evolution of cone structure. Crossbills in turn adapt to those average cones, as you see in the lower right here of a type 5 red crossbill. But there are mountain ranges to the east of the Rockies, like the Cypress Hills, and to the west in the South Hills and the Albions, where red squirrels are absent. And in the absence of red squirrels, the cones, the trees have lost squirrel defenses. And in the absence of squirrels, crossbills have increased in abundance because they no longer have that seed competitor. So crossbills are about 20 times more abundant in the South Hills and Albions than they are in the Rocky Mountains. They now exert strong selection on the cones, favoring thicker scales on the distal ends of the cones where the crossbills feed. This favors larger bills, deeper bills in the crossbills, which in turn allows them to get access into those seeds, which in turn exerts strong selection for even thicker scales, which in turn favors even thicker bills, which in turn favors thicker scales. And so what we have is this coevolutionary arms race between crossbills and the pine, leading to this very large-billed crossbill, and also a crossbill with distinct calls and distinct songs. And it's virtually or almost completely reproductively isolated from other crossbills that move into the South Hills and Albions every year and also will breed there. And the reason squirrels haven't colonized the South Hills or the Albions, or didn't colonize the Cypress Hills, was because in the east of the Rockies, the islands of pines there are separated or isolated by barriers of prairie, of grassland, whereas in the South Hills areas, we have the Great Basin Desert. So they're isolated by sagebrush steppe habitat, which squirrels will not cross. Unfortunately, there was a distinct crossbill, just like the one in the Cassia Crossbill in the Cypress Hills. It was collected by Canadian ornithologists in the 30s and 40s, the 1930s and 40s. And so there's specimens in museums in Canada, at least in 2 museums. But unfortunately, in 1950, they introduced squirrels to the Cypress Hills. And so this crossbill appears to be either extremely rare or is extinct, because the squirrels now are extremely common and harvest a good fraction of the cones every year. They're much more common in the Cypress Hills than they are in the Rockies because they've lost squirrel defenses. So this shows a photograph of the South Hills looking south into Nevada. So Nevada is these mountain ranges here are Nevada, and even the valley there, the Great Basin Desert. But you have patches of lodgepole pine throughout the South Hills. There's also subalpine fir, but the crossbills don't feed for the most part on subalpine fir. And I mentioned they're reproductively isolated, the Cassia crossbills. They're reproductively isolated from red crossbills. They rarely interbreed with them, and they're genetically distinct. So this is based on a lot of different very variable locations in the DNA of the crossbills. And basically what it shows is that the Cassia crossbill is very distinct from all the other call types. You can see type 5s and 2s are somewhat distinct, but they're much closer. And they do hybridize much more frequently between each other, much more frequently than do Cassia crossbills with these other call types. And then the Cassia crossbills also differ in a lot of other ways, in other different ecological, they have very different ecologies, which also probably causes hybrids to not survive very well as in addition. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the Cassia crossbill, other than what I just explained in terms of this coevolutionary arms race. Well, the reason they're sedentary here is that the seed crops from lodgepole pine in the South Hills are remarkably stable. They are more stable than any other seed producing plant in the world that we know of. Remember, I showed you data for ponderosa pine. So 1 year you have a large cone crop, the next 2 or 3 years you have very few seeds produced, then you have another large cone crop, and so forth. These are data for Norway spruce. It seems like almost every other year there's a good cone crop and then a failure, good cone crop and a failure, or roughly that. But this is on the right, lower right here, we have the number of seeds per 3 branches for 78 trees. So each point represents a different tree. And the mean from year to year is just this line connecting it, the means. And you can see that almost every year the same number of seeds are produced. It's really remarkable how stable that seed production is. There's no red squirrels. There's no reason to fluctuate. Whereas they do fluctuate some, lodgepole pine in the Rockies where there are squirrels. In addition, if you don't have squirrels, every tree that is serotinous, whose cones stay closed, they gather and they accumulate on the tree for decades. And so crossbills can't feed on the closed cones that are less than about 6 years old. They're just too hard. And only when the cones get 10, 15, 20 years old and they weather and they turn gray, but once they start to form gaps between the scales, the crossbills can then get a couple seeds from those cones. And so when a foraging bout, they might forage on one cone that's 10 years old, then one that's 20 years old, and one that's 15 years old, get a few seeds here, a few seeds there, and so forth. So not only do you have this very stable seed production, you have this gradual renewal, or you have this, I should say, the gradual weathering of these cones in this seed cone bank. And so the seed availability is fairly constant over time. It does fluctuate, and it fluctuates because of the variation in the demand by the crossbills. So when they start nesting, the feeding rates are really high or reasonably high. And then as they have more mouths to feed and there's greater depletion of seeds, feeding rates go down. And then when the young mostly die in late summer, early fall, the feeding rates go back up again. Then they start nesting in the spring and the feeding rates go down again and so forth. So the crossbills are driving the availability of the seeds, but they're fairly constant compared to what you'd find anywhere else. And so what we expected was that the crossbill population be highly stable. And from about 2000, or from 1998 to about 2003 or so, the state population seemed very stable. But then after that, the population started to decline. And what I have here is census data, survey data of Cassia Crossbills in the South Hills from 2003 to 2011. And you can see that the population declined tremendously. It declined by 83% over that time interval. And it was rather depressing to see because you weren't sure what was going to happen. And initially it wasn't clear what was going on. Which you might think, and given where you live in the Front Range, and given that you spend time up in the Rockies, around 2010 or so, in 2000, a little earlier, we had a massive outbreak of bark beetles. And this is on the west side of Rocky Mountain Park in 2010. You can see a lot of dead and dying spruce, as well as spruce, but a lot of lodgepole pine. But in the South Hills at the same time, there was very few, relatively few lodgepole dying. There were bark beetles killing a fair number of trees, but nothing that you found there. Every year, bark beetles are killing trees in the South Hills, but there's never been a big outbreak. You can see a few trees maybe in the lower right here that are dying from bark beetles in this photograph. So it wasn't bark beetles that was causing the decline. And actually, what we found is after 2011, the population rebounded. And if it was bark beetles, they couldn't have rebounded that quickly. The forests aren't going to recover that quickly. And so what was causing this decline and then the rebound? Well, it turns out what I think caused the decline was hot summer temperatures. And this shows the number of hot summer days in terms of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees centigrade. And you can see in 2003, there were 8 of those days. And usually before that, except for right around 2002 in there were very few of those days. But 2003 was the year there was the heat wave in Europe where tens of thousands of people died. And there was a heat wave in the Northern Rockies, including in southern Idaho, where there are massive fires, especially in the Glacier Park area. So why would hot summer days cause that decline starting in 2003? Well, hot summer days cause the cones to open and shed their seeds in the summer instead of having them gradually become available throughout the year. So this is a photograph of a thermal imaging camera that I took of a lodgepole pine cone in the South Hills. And you can see the cone in the sun here. The surface temperature is 48 degrees centigrade. And so temperatures of about 45 degrees plus or minus 5 degrees are temperatures at which lodgepole pine cones begin to open. Those are sufficiently hot if they last long enough to cause those cones to open and shed their seeds. And so that's what I think happened with these hot summer days, caused these cones to open, especially the ones that might have been the ones that were beginning to open that the crossbills could get seeds from. And that caused the massive decline in those crossbills. And what we have plotted here is the percent change in the population from year to year of the Cassia crossbill. And it's based on this survey data on the left here that I showed earlier. And then on the x-axis here, we have the number of hot days in the previous 4 years. And what you can see is when there are more hot days in the previous 4 years, the population decreases by about 20% per year. But when there are 2 or fewer hot days in the previous 4 years, the population increased. And this is kind of concerning. It's very concerning because if you look at the projections for the number of hot summer days in the future of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or more, or 32 degrees centigrade or higher, there's going to be a big increase in the number of hot summer days. And so in southern Idaho and the South Hills, there were very few, presumably at the highest points there in the mountains, there were closer to 0, 1 or 2 hot summer days every year or 2 or 3. But we can expect that by the end of this century, there's going to be maybe a month of hot summer days. And we saw that just 4 hot summer days in the previous 4 years is enough to cause the crossbill population to decline by about 20% a year, year after year. That's not good news for this crossbill. In addition, the projected distributions of lodgepole pine suggest that by the end of this century, there will be very few lodgepole in the South Hills or Albions. This is a paper from 2011. What they did is they modeled the distribution, the current distribution of lodgepole pine. Here's the South Hills and the Albions. They modeled it based on the current distribution and climatic variables. And then they used, since they were able to predict this distribution quite well, they then entered in basically the future climates, and they projected the distribution of lodgepole pine, say at 2080. And you can see that there won't be any lodgepole pine within 100 or more miles of the South Hills and Albions. And we also know that there's been an increase in fires. There's been an increase in the frequency of fires. There's an increase in the severity of fires. And there's an increase in the size of the fires. And last fall in 2020, in September, there was a badger fire, and it burned 90,000 acres in the South Hills. Cassia crossbills are only found in 67 square kilometers of lodgepole pine. That's all the lodgepole pine there occurs in the Albions and the South Hills. And I was up in the South Hills and the Albions last summer, and this is what it looks like in a lot of these areas. This is mostly fir here, but there are areas around here with lodgepole pine. The fir really burned bad and really hot. But in these areas, there's very little recruitment of seedlings of lodgepole pine. The only place you'd find them would be in the shadow or the lee sides of logs or large stones where soil had accumulated and presumably some moisture, maybe snow drifts and so forth, where there was enough moisture to keep these things and also enough soil there for these seedlings to do well. This shows a map of where the fire occurred. So the pink shows the area of fire. The dark areas represent where lodgepole pine occurs. And you can see that the fire burnt a lot of the lodgepole pine, probably 25, maybe up to 30% of the lodgepole pine. There's variable intensity or severity of the fire. So some areas, the forests were largely left intact. And in other areas, there's virtually no surviving pines for many tens of meters or hundreds of meters around. So this shows again the area of fire. And so in 2016, we estimated there were 5,800 Cassia crossbills. That's all the crossbills in the world of Cassias. Based on the amount of forests that burned, probably in the ballpark of 4,000 crossbills after that fire, or by the end of the winter. But what also happened in 2020 is that there were 4 hot summer days. There hadn't been any since about 2009 or 2007. I guess 2007 was the last time there were several hot summer days. But there were 4 last summer, or in 2020, the summer before last. And so we expected the population to decline even more, and more, it'll decline even more in the next couple of years. So the outlook is not favorable. And actually this July, Kristen Nunes, who I think is in the audience here, he recorded some crossbills just southwest of Granby in Colorado. And they were Cassia crossbills. And those are the very first Cassia crossbills ever recorded outside of the South Hills and Albions. None of the color-banded Cassia crossbills have ever shown up, and nobody's ever recorded a Cassia crossbill elsewhere. And I wouldn't be surprised that when you have these hot summer days and declining seed availability for these birds, well, when you expect 20% decline or die off of the crossbills, that some of these birds, or a good fraction of those birds, might wander and search for somewhere else. Unfortunately, they aren't very efficient at foraging on lodgepole pine outside the South Hills. The type 5 is much more efficient. And they aren't very efficient. They wouldn't be very competitive with the ponderosa pine birds and ponderosa pine forests. So these birds are just not likely to survive very well. And then, as we all know, and I mentioned, we have this large increase in fires. This is from the New York Times a year ago. And it shows the amount of land burned on the West Coast. So this is California, Oregon, and Washington. So it's not the Rockies, and it's not the South Hills and Albions, but it's indicative or reflects what's going on in the West. And you can see how the amount of area burned is just increasing tremendously. And then 2020 was up here in October. And we know, unfortunately, that fires continued well beyond October in the West last year, and as well as this year. And so with that, I'd like to just conclude by summarizing, or just mentioning the main things I've talked about. Why crossbills are nomadic? They're nomadic because of fluctuating cone crops. And often there's a lot of synchrony between, let's say, within ponderosa pine over large areas, or Engelmann spruce, or whatever it is. And so crossbills have to wander great distances to find another area with a good cone crop when there's a cone failure. They have cross mandibles because it allows them to exert strong biting forces at the tip, which are needed to form gaps between closed cone scales to get access to those seeds, so they can then laterally abduct the mandibles to spread the scales apart. The crossbill diversity is related just simply to the size and hardness of the cones, as well as the sizes of the seeds, which influences the palate structure. Cassia crossbills they're unusual for crossbills in that they're highly sedentary. We net crossbills usually, actually, we net them underneath at the base of one cabin where they come to salt, and we use 2 little nets, 12-meter nets. 12-meter nets, and only about 4 feet high, the nets, because they're coming to the ground to get salts. And we have 2 little nets, and we'll catch up to 80 crossbills in the net in one day, usually around 30 or 40. But we catch the same crossbill year after year in the same nets. They're very sedentary. And that's because there's no squirrels, the cone crops are highly stable, and they're engaged in this coevolutionary arms race. And the future of the Cassia crossbills, and unfortunately, the future of many crossbills is going to be one of declines and hopefully not too many extinctions. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was fabulous. What a wonderful intertwined story of trees and birds and mammals and climate and all the stuff. Are there questions, folks? If you have one, you can raise your hand using the reactions button, or you can turn on your video and wave at me. I have a question while we're waiting for others to think. How did you get started on this story? Did you go hunting for a squirrel-free forest? Did you, how did you discover this little pocket of crossbills that are in this unusual?
Well, I was working on, I thought a lot about the Newfoundland crossbill. And the Newfoundland crossbill, there was about 9,000 years ago, black spruce colonized Newfoundland as the glaciers retreated, after the glaciers retreated. And then presumably crossbills colonized it, but squirrels didn't. And there's a very large-billed crossbill. But I'd been to Newfoundland a number of times in the late 80s and never saw a red crossbill, never saw the Newfoundland crossbill, saw white-winged crossbills with no Newfoundland crossbill. I was looking for white wings mostly though. And it got me thinking about what was going on. How could you have such a large-billed crossbill when the forests are basically white-winged crossbill habitat, which is the most slender, tiny-billed crossbill in the New World. And yet the Newfoundland crossbill is huge. And I started thinking, there were no squirrels. They introduced squirrels in 1963, unfortunately. And that's what caused the decline in the Newfoundland crossbill. And so I started thinking about islands without squirrels. And then I moved west. And then I started working on these crossbills and trying to understand that diversity. And it turns out the Cypress Hills, there was a study of lodgepole pine from Yukon down to Colorado. And the Cypress Hills, the cones were very distinct. They were very large. And it turns out a couple of years earlier, I was in Ottawa and I was measuring white-winged crossbills, and I told the curator there, a guy named Earl Godfrey, who wrote the Birds of Canada, told him about the Newfoundland crossbill, the story that I made up of, and I came up with trying to figure out why it had a big bill, no squirrels and so on. He said, you got to go to the Cypress Hills. And because there's a huge billed crossbill there and it's resident, it's really common. And so I was able to go there. I measured the crossbills he collected. They were in Ottawa. And I kind of filed that away. And eventually I got to the Cypress Hills. And then I started, went to some other islands east in Montana where there were no squirrels, but they were small without crossbills, without a resident crossbill. And I just was trying to find other areas west of the Rockies. And so I was looking at maps without squirrels, and I was trying to get replicates of these sites with and without squirrels. Because I wrote a grant proposal to NSF, and they said, you need more replicates. And so I was flying to Boise to go to a bird meeting. I was living in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I flew to Salt Lake, rented a car, went to the Albions, because there were no squirrels there, and there were no squirrels in the South Hills. And, but they showed in the maps very little pine. But when I got there was a lot of pine. And I thought, oh my God, I looked at the cones. There's got to be a crossbill that's this big, a 9.9 millimeter, because that's what the Cypress Hills crossbill was from the ones I measured. So I went to the bird meeting in Boise. I said, I found a new crossbill, I think. And then the next year I went back there to South Hills and captured them and recorded them. And sure enough, they had distinct calls. And I wasn't sure about the calls. I thought they might be different. I'm not that great with my ears, not like a lot of the really good birders out there now. And or really good birders in the past. And I'm not that, I thought they sounded different, but I wasn't confident. I felt like, oh, maybe I'm thinking I want them to be different. So I went back the next year and sure enough, they were different. And
great.
Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat from Ramesh or Suzanne. How do the crossbills anticipate where to find forests with cones?
That's a really good question. And I don't have an answer for it. I'm sure they're smart as I am in terms of conifers. And I imagine they're a lot smarter. They're really good at being crossbills. If you ask them questions, and I've done a lot of asking them questions in the lab where I've done experiments, and they're really clever at being a good crossbill and being efficient at feeding on cones and locating seeds and assessing patches and so forth. So I imagine that they pay attention to cone buds, so they know they're flying along and they say, oh, there's no cones here, but next year there's going to be a good cone crop here. And I'm sure they file that away. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. I don't, maybe there's some strategy of movements of where you go. If you've gone this way, maybe you go a different route. But these birds probably live on average 2 years, the nomadic ones. So probably don't have that much time for memory. They do move in flocks, so there might be an older bird or two that might have experience. But I don't know, other than, you know, they might know a year or two, you know, they might know where the next year a good cone crop will be. They might have passed an area where it wasn't good, but cone buds were there and they would develop into cones the next year. The white-winged crossbill, which I studied a lot in the 80s, you could follow it on American birds in the 80s. You didn't have eBird then. And I was studying them in the Northeast, and they'd leave the Northeast and I'd be out of luck for a year, but they'd show up in Alaska and the Yukon. And then you could follow them across the boreal forest. And some would drift down the Rockies, and they'd even show up when there was a huge cone crop. One showed up in Las Vegas, and they'd show up down even to Colorado, I think. But then you could just kind of follow them going across the boreal forest. So someone in Europe, they described the flights of the two-barred crossbills, kind of a pendulum flights across the forest. And that's what you can kind of think of as they probably just start, you know, they start in Alaska and they just fly kind of southeast, east-southeast across the boreal forest, and they might end up in Newfoundland. And if they end up in Newfoundland, they're kind of, and they haven't found anything, they're going to be out of luck. And they probably go then down the coast. And you do get them down to New Jersey and farther south than that. But yeah, I don't have a good, it would be great if you could put transmitters on these, and maybe in a few years, you'll be able to do that on these nomadic birds. And it'd be really great if we knew kind of the patterns of cone production over time. In the Rockies, the Colorado Rockies, we have these, you know, big mountains. The cone crops aren't as extensive often, so that you can go to the Twin Lakes and you'll find a big ponderosa pine cone crop. Then you'll come over to the Front Range and there'll be no ponderosa pine. And so it's more localized here, but when you go farther north where the land is flat and the climate is more uniform, then you have larger scale cone failures and cone crops. It's kind of a long-winded answer to say that I don't know.
All right. Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions now. Carol, go ahead and ask your question. Carol, okay.
Oh, will crossbills be separated into different species in the near future? We hear about 9 or 10 different separate species.
I suspect not. Our genetic, we're now looking at the whole genomes of these birds. So we look at a lot of, basically all their genes, and then some. The Cassia Crossbill remains very, very distinct. It's very young. We thought but anyway, to answer the type 2s and 5s, for example, they're fairly closely related. They probably only diverged, our estimate right now is about 1,200 years ago. So they're really young. Yet genetically, we can tell them apart. So, but we do find that they interbreed a lot more than the Cassia Crossbill breeds with other red crossbills or red crossbills. I don't think there's, the only one that I would hold out hope that would be split, we don't have, we do have DNA, but we haven't done any analyses of it, is the one in Central America. All the others are either like a subspecies, they're just geographically distinct, or they're just not that different genetically. And my hunch is that the Cassia Crossbill has these ecological conditions that really result in very strong reproductive isolation year after year after year, which is not the case for type 2s and 5s, for example. When they feed on Engelmann spruce and they both breed on that, there's a lot of hybridization, relatively a lot. When they feed on the pines, they act like Cassia Crossbills. There's very little hybridization. Sometimes we will find no hybrid pairs when they're breeding on pines in the same area. But I don't think we'll find in North America more. In Europe, I think there will be, like the Moroccan or the Atlas Mountain crossbill, I think deserves to be recognized as a species. It's very distinct genetically. And there's probably others like the Vietnamese crossbill that deserve to be ranked as a species. I bet they're pretty darn old and very different genetically, and they're very different from anything near it in terms of a crossbill. I don't think they would ever hybridize with any other crossbill. Although we find hybridization now with the genomic data we find gene flow between wing-barred crossbills, especially in Europe, the two-barred crossbill and common crossbills even. So who knows?
Thanks.
But I don't think we'll have more. No, we won't have. I don't think there's going to be.
Maybe you can unpack for us just a bit about how you as a biologist think about, I guess this word type. There's a couple of questions in the chat that have to do with this. Is that a hedging kind of word? Like they're different, but they're not different enough to call them subspecies, or is that a formal biological term that is used in other species?
No, they just Jeff Groth made it up. It's just Jeff would argue that they're species. What he did argue in his dissertation. Prior to Jeff's work, what we recognize is if you saw that the map, there were all those numbers on the map of common red crossbills, and all those numbers represented different subspecies. But it turns out they aren't subspecies in the sense that subspecies usually have discrete areas where each subspecies breeds. But you can go up to in the mountains here, in the Engelmann spruce area, or where there's a mixture where lodgepole and ponderosa pine interdigitate, and you'll find nests of both species right next to each other. And you'll find a nest of a type 2 in a ponderosa pine tree, and you'll have type 5s flying around and landing in the tree, and they nest just next door. And you can see a nest of the other species there. So they aren't geographic races. They aren't subspecies. So they aren't subspecies, but they're and he didn't recognize them as, they aren't recognized as species because genetically, to date, we haven't been able to show they're very different, except for the Cassia Crossbill. And actually, when we found the results for the Cassia Crossbill in 2016, or at least that's when it was published, I was really stunned. I expected maybe the Cassia Crossbill maybe would be a little bit different, but it was so young. I thought there would be other ones that were older, and they would be more different. But the Cassia Crossbill, even though it's probably less than 20,000 years old, our best guess now is around 16,000 years ago that it diverged. It's just surprising that it's so distinct genetically, because these other crossbills breed there every year in the same area. And that's kind of the best test for whether they're species or not. Do they co-occur and breed in the same area and not interbreed? They do interbreed, but we have no evidence that there's integration, so that you might get a hybrids. We know there's hybrids. We've seen families that are hybrid families, but we don't have any genetic evidence that those hybrids survive and breed back and back cross, and so we get intermediates. We just don't find that in the patterns. And so we suspect that they just don't do very well, and there's a variety of reasons why they might not.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions about what they eat. One from Melanie. Are the crossbills ever successful in uncovering the squirrels' hordes? And a related question from Jay. Are there other foods they can eat or do eat when pressed?
I've never seen them raid hordes of squirrels. I've seen nutcrackers do that, but never a crossbill. Red squirrels are pretty feisty. And usually in the fall, it's not the time that food is scarce. It's usually late winter and spring. And by then the cones are buried underneath. And often in the winter, especially, there's snow covering it. And the squirrels go through little tunnels to get to the middens. So crossbills, they're not going to be able to exploit those. And when there aren't cones, they will feed on other things. There's lots of records of them eating other things. I hardly ever have seen them eat other things. Insects, I've seen white wings eat on hatches of insects that come out on the snow, hopping around on snow in, let's say, April, May, and in northern Quebec or north of Quebec City up in the Laurentian Mountains. I've seen white wings eat spruce budworms. They eat aphids. They'll go to galls and get insects out of galls. So So Cassia crossbills almost never eat anything but conifer seeds. My students have seen it once or twice that they eat insects. It turns out that when you find crossbills normally eating insects is in the spring, because that's when seeds are least available, because that's when the seeds have mostly fallen out of the cones and the new cone crop hasn't developed yet. And so there's a kind of a window of scarcity of seeds. And that fortunately is in May, late May, June, and that's when days are getting long and they're warm, and there's lots of insects. And so crossbills of other types you'll find them eating insects then. But Cassia crossbills, that's almost when the peak of seed availability is. And so when seeds get scarce, it's more late summer, and when it's getting warm and really dry, late summer, and there aren't many insects around. And so the Cassia crossbills aren't feeding on them then. Yeah.
Question from Brenda. Are there efforts to replant lodgepole in the burned area, and could that be effective?
It could be very effective, and it might need to be done. The Forest Service is very interested in this. Actually, I'm going to be on a phone conference call with them, and maybe it's this Saturday. Yeah, it's this Saturday. And they're watching it and doing surveys more so than the next year or two. They want to wait to see how the seedlings grow. But there might be a lot of planting if that's the case. And then we're trying to figure out also what to do in terms of management. So that's important to get the seedlings growing and surviving. It might require some watering too, because it is a dry area and it's not getting wetter, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you. Question from Stan. Are any of the Sky Islands in the Southwest squirrel free, and do they have any unique crossbills?
They're trying to think of, well, when you go south, the red squirrels get to the Mogollon Rim. So across the northern part of Arizona, just south of Flagstaff, north of the Verde Valley, and cross down to the Gila. And then there's this Cyrus aberdi, your black squirrel here. It occurs down there. And it occurs farther down into the Sierra Madre. The red squirrel is one on the mountain east of Mount Graham, east of which you might have heard about, where they put in telescopes, and they've cut down forests to put in telescopes for the University of Arizona. And the Mount Graham squirrel is only in a small area, and it's highly endangered. But most of those islands have they have Apache fox squirrels. When you like the Chiricahuas, the Huachucas, and they harvest cones. But when you get away from riparian areas, they tend to drop out. So they're effectively in the higher elevations, the Sky Islands closer to the border. They don't have red squirrels for sure, and they don't have really a tree squirrel. They might have rock squirrels, but they aren't going to be important. And so, but there aren't conifers there that are stable from year to year in terms of cone production. And that's why the people have introduced the parrots, the thick-billed parrots back in the 80s. It was doomed for failure because they fluctuate in cone production. So to try to think that you could actually get a resident thick-billed parrot north of the border was wishful thinking. It was I was rather puzzled that attempt was made. So no, there's no crossbill that's endemic. There's a Mexican crossbill, the type 6, the largest billed New World crossbill that comes into the Sky Islands. Feeds on Apache pine and feeds on the Chihuahuan pine, and probably on the Pinus arizonica, which is like a ponderosa pine. But no, unfortunately there's nothing down there. And then there's I get asked, I don't know of any other. If there was, you can bet that I would have been looking for gone there. I've gone to islands all over the world. It's been a good excuse to go to the Caribbean and go to the Mediterranean and go to and so forth. So we've worked on Cyprus and Mallorca and Corsica and so on, because there's crossbills and no squirrels.
Peter has a question. Is the relatively rapid speciation of the Cassia crossbill unusual compared to other species separations?
Yeah, it is. It's highly unusual. most people think of birds speciating and taking about 1 million years, and minimally hundreds of thousands of years usually. But most species are thought to take, for speciation in birds, usually takes 1 to 2 million years is what people believe. And that's, the most evidence supports that. That seems very reasonable, or at least in hundreds of thousands of years. And so let's say if our genomic data, the analyses of the genomic data are correct as of now, and we'll have a better idea in a few more months. Let's say 16 or 17,000 years, I can't remember which one, plus or minus, from about 4,000 years to about 30-something thousand years or 40,000 years. That would be almost unprecedented from the bird world.
All right, there's a question from Doug about sort of the state of research on crossbills. Is there similar work to yours going on with other types of crossbills? Is there more research interest in the crossbill as a species broadly, sort of given this kind of example of speciation? Darwin's finches come to mind.
Yeah, let's see. So similar work to yours. There isn't much work being done. It's hard to study crossbills. It's really hard to study them. The only reason I'm studying crossbills, was you can measure feeding rates. You can measure feeding rates in the field throughout the year round. So I can measure how many calories per unit time a crossbill can get. I can measure the seasonal availability of the seasonal availability of seeds to these crossbills, and I could bring them into the lab, and I could ask them the same questions that I couldn't sometimes ask in the wild. Well, why don't you feed on this conifer? How good are you as bill size changes? It varies. So you can compare white wings to reds, or different call types to each other, and or different sizes individually within a call type. And that's, I think, the big advantage of studying crossbills, is that you can measure food resources, the availability, which is almost impossible to do with almost any other bird in the world. You can measure seed availability for Darwin's finches. I saw Darwin's finches in that question. You can measure at least for seeds. It's hard to measure in their breeding, because in the breeding season, they're eating caterpillars. And it's really hard to measure, what kind of caterpillar was that? How big was that? You don't know. Seeds you can measure seeds, and the seed size doesn't vary that much. And the specific caloric value, the nutritive value, doesn't vary that much among seeds and within a tree or among trees of a given species. And so it's really easy to know how it varies. And whereas you can't do that for any other system. But besides that, then crossbills really diminish in terms of ease of study. And so there's good reasons why people don't study crossbills other than opportunistically. And you get more of an observation of crossbills. Oh, we found them here and they bred in this area this winter, and that's about it. And the only reason I continued studying crossbills after the mid-90s was I found the Cassia crossbill. And then I started realizing that these crossbills co-evolve with conifers, and that's what got me stuck with this. And so the answer is that there aren't people that they study the breeding physiology, the endocrinology, where you can go out and catch the birds when they're common one year, and you can measure the hormones in them, measure the size of their testes and so forth. And that's one kind of groups of studies that have been done in the West. But besides that, it's really more of just where the call types occur. And that's what's kind of the state of the matter in Europe, other than the Scottish crossbill and in the Highlands of Scotland. So Ron Summers has studied the Scottish crossbill because of the endangered status of that bird. He's from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. He lives in Inverness. So they've been studying the crossbills intensively there. And then on the east side of that, over by Aberdeen, and the D side, they've been studying in the field the crossbills, the parrot crossbills common in the Scottish. But a lot of there's not a lot of work being done right now that I know of. So yeah, long answer that there's not much being done.
Well,
But
it's
I
a
don't
great,
really highly recommend it as a system, especially not a student. Unless there's something that you really know what you can do. I mean, I have students that have worked on, and I don't have any students right now. I'm going to retire in the next year or so. And so I'm kind of stepping out of it. I'm keeping, anyway, but my students have worked on crossbills, but it's more of like, I know things will work. And even then it can be tricky too.
well, what a great story. What a great talk. Thanks everybody for coming. And thank you, Craig, for the talk. And if people want to hit their reaction buttons to give Craig a hand, please do.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. And, go look for crossbills in a year or two. Not right now.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye.